March 22nd, 1944. Kassel, Germany, fog pressed low over the freight yards, thick enough to soften the glow of lanterns and dull the clang of distant couplings. The frost-laced air bit through wool coats, coating each breath in white. Engineer Otto Kramer crouched beside a row of freight cars, their metal skins glimmering faintly under a web of frost. Inside the cars, thousands of shells and electrical fuses waited, bound for the Eastern Front. The convoy was due to depart before dawn. The order was clear: verify, seal, and sign off. No alterations, no improvisation. Yet the wiring inside one junction box looked wrong. Too tight, too bright under the lamplight, as if the insulation itself had thinned. He traced the line with his gloved hand, feeling warmth that shouldn't have been there. A guard's lantern swung lazily in the distance, the beam cutting through fog and striking the stenciled word Sprengstoff on each crate. Otto's heart slowed into the rhythm of machinery. He knew the checklist by memory: resistance test, continuity, arm-safe verification. All green, all approved. But his fingers paused over a single relay, an old model known to overheat when stored near cold metal. He'd read about it once, a buried note in an engineering bulletin. Replacements were due next quarter. He should move on. Still, that faint hum in the coil. It felt alive. The freight supervisor's voice broke the silence. 5 minutes to clearance. Otto nodded without turning. His pencil hovered above the report form. The relay's resistance read within tolerance, yet its glow seemed to pulse faintly in the fog. He could pass it, he could meet his quota, but he saw the train's path in his mind. Miles of snowbound track, the vibration of steel, the heat of brakes. One shorted wire and the whole line could vanish before sunrise. He lifted the fuse panel, rewound the contact spring by half a turn, and added an improvised resistor from his own toolkit, a forbidden adjustment. The hum faded. Silence returned. He exhaled slowly, sealing the cover. In the distance, a locomotive coughed awake, expelling a plume that drifted like smoke from a battlefield. The train was rolling east. Otto watched it vanish into the fog, the rails gleaming like twin strands of wire stretching toward a horizon he'd never see. Hours later, news would filter back: an air raid on the Kassel yard at dawn, direct hits on loaded convoys. The train he'd cleared was one of the few that made it out intact. In the debrief, no one mentioned the relay. No one asked about the adjustment. The forms all read operational. He signed them quietly, handed them in, and returned to the line. Years later, he would recall the warmth of that faulty coil more vividly than the war itself, a simple contact point bridged by instinct. In the machinery of war, the smallest decision could outlast the men who made it. The system endured because someone, somewhere, broke the rule at the right time. Before the war, Otto Kramer worked beneath the soft rattle of trams in Stuttgart. His hands were steady, his tools lined in perfect order, his repairs invisible when done right. The hum of copper through relays and carbon brushes was his rhythm. Measured, precise, quiet. He preferred it that way. The machine spoke in small signals, in the warmth of contact points, in the faint click when current found its path again. To Otto, the sound of electricity was the sound of control, something that obeyed logic, unlike men. By 1944, that same logic had been conscripted. Circuits he once tuned for trams now triggered fuses, detonators, and proximity relays. His workbench changed, but his hands didn't. He still leaned close, listening for the faint buzz of a live wire or the stutter of a dying one. Around him, soldiers came and went, voices always too loud, boots too heavy. Otto stayed by the wiring tables where silence meant function. He'd earned a reputation among the yard crews. When a unit failed, they called for the tuner. He could make broken detonators sing again, sometimes with nothing more than a scrap of copper or a drop of solder scavenged from a dead radio. He rarely spoke at mess. His comfort came from the steady order of his work, the torque of a screw, the balance of heat on a coil. Yet something had changed since the early years. Each inspection blurred into the next. Freight cars rolled east with labels he didn't read anymore. He knew what they carried: explosives, anti-tank shells, mines. He'd stopped asking which front they were bound for. Each car was an artery feeding a body that never slept. The system moved with precision, even when men faltered. The rules that governed him came from above, typed, signed, and sealed. No modification without authorization. No reconfiguration of tested circuits. He followed them at first. Then the failures began, small, unrecorded malfunctions. Circuits tested in warmth but died in cold. Fuses tripped under vibration. Once, an entire batch of timing units failed during transfer. He'd known the reason instantly. The insulation oil had thinned below freezing. He filed a report. It was ignored, so he began to adjust them quietly. Half-turns, hidden resistors, shortened delay springs, tiny deviations that no inspector would notice. He told himself it wasn't rebellion, just correction. But correction became habit. The system rewarded silence, not initiative. He fixed things no one saw. Sometimes that meant saving a shipment from destruction. Other times it meant preventing one. He never said which. The war blurred intentions the same way fog blurred the rails. One line disappearing into another until direction itself felt uncertain. By late winter, his face carried the same fatigue as the machinery he serviced. Oil under the nails, smoke in the jacket, the faint tremor of exhaustion mistaken for cold. He slept in barracks lined with tools instead of books, his bunk lit by the glow of an instrument lamp. He still heard the current at night, the low vibration through the walls. The machines didn't care if the war was won or lost. They only cared about contact, about flow. To the men above him, he was a name on an efficiency ledger, another technician keeping the supply lines breathing. To the men beside him, he was the quiet one who stayed behind after inspection, who never joined the jokes, who always looked at wires longer than necessary. To the system, he was perfect, reliable, invisible, replaceable. But in the still hours between trains, Otto Kremer sometimes wondered if the machines had it right. They endured without belief, without hesitation. They failed only when touched by human hands. In a world built on circuits and orders, who decides when a correction becomes defiance? The ammunition trains leaving Kassel were not trains in the ordinary sense. They were arteries, iron and pressure, feeding the 4th Panzer Army across the eastern plains. Each line carried the rhythm of the Reich's war machine. Shells, primers, propellant, all measured not by need, but by tonnage. Every 6 hours, without deviation, a train rolled out. Its departure clocked like a heartbeat. Delay was not tolerated. Efficiency was doctrine. Under the pale glare of lanterns, Otto Kremer's crew worked in near silence. Their breath clouded above the brass and copper stacked high around them. The yard smelled of frost, steam, and oil. Every sound was mechanical. Chains dragged, couplings struck, valves hissed. The locomotives stood alive but waiting, their boilers thrumming under restraint, like animals held in check. Otto moved among them, clipboard tucked under one arm, his fingers gloved and blackened from contact grease. The checklist in his mind had long replaced the one on paper. Somewhere deeper in the yard, an engine coughed once and went still. The sound carried through fog like a warning swallowed by steam. Men paused briefly, then resumed their work. Schedules ruled here. One delay meant a missed transfer at Leipzig, which meant artillery at the front waiting dry. Otto knew it well. The chain of consequence stretched farther than any one of them could see. The yardmasters called it precision. He called it pressure. At 02:30 a.m., he stood beside a line of flat cars stacked with crates stamped Sprengstoff A in red ink. The marking glistened faintly beneath the frost. Beneath the wood planks lay coiled fusing cables, pressure sensors, and detonator assemblies. His domain. Each system wired for function, none for forgiveness. Otto ran his hand across a sealed junction box, feeling the hum beneath the casing, slight but present. The engines were supposed to sleep before dispatch, yet the current whispered otherwise. Perfection hides its own decay. He knew that line instinctively. The Reichsbahn's central command demanded timing down to the minute. Reports from Kassel were transmitted hourly. Car numbers, fuse lots, net weight, pressure readings. Human error was treated as an interruption of rhythm. In this system, hesitation could register louder than sabotage. Otto had seen men reprimanded for less, for wiping oil at the wrong moment, for closing a switch too early, too late. The trains left on time, whether right or wrong. By Oro 3 Pramax AM, steam vented through the frost in slow columns, drifting upward like smoke from invisible fires. The locomotives began to stir, one after another, hissing through their valves, clanking softly against couplers. A foreman's whistle pierced the air. Two long, one short. Departure. The rails rang as the convoy began to move, slow and deliberate, its iron rhythm syncing with the breath of the men beside it. Otto watched it pass, each car sliding into darkness. He could trace the order of their loading by sound alone. The heavier shells first, the propellant cars later, the fuse cars last. He knew where this train was going. Through Leipzig, Görlitz, then southeast to the front. 300 miles of track, 24 relay stations. One error would ripple through every mile. Yet the system didn't account for hesitation, only motion. Its beauty lay in its blindness. The trains moved as long as men obeyed. As the final car disappeared, Otto turned back toward the silent engine that had failed earlier. The frost had thickened around its vents, sealing it like a tomb. He stared for a moment, then moved on, his breath steady in the cold. In the great order of war, the machine was perfect because it could not feel. The men who served it carried the burden of knowing when perfection became dangerous. Otto Kremer understood that balance better than most. The rhythm between obedience and instinct, between flow and failure. Every convoy that left Kassel was part of a living system, predictable, relentless, exact. And somewhere within that rhythm, a single hand had to decide when to break it. At dawn, frost began to melt across the freight yard, releasing a thin mist that hovered over the rails like smoke that refused to rise. The steel tracks gleamed faintly, wet and cold, catching the weak reflection of lanterns still burning from the night shift. Otto Kremer moved along the line with his inspection ledger tucked under one arm, his breath steady, his thoughts slower. He had slept only 2 hours. The air carried a taste of iron and soot. To the east, an engine rumbled awake, venting pale steam that drifted sideways through the mist. The day's first train was being readied for departure. 32 freight cars loaded with fuses, shells, and propellant bags bound for the 4th Panzer Army. He paused at Junction 17, where a coupling plate joined 2 circuits feeding the fuse carriages. The surface bore faint scorch marks, thin, precise arcs that spidered outward from a contact point. To most eyes, it would pass for residue from routine load discharge. But Otto knew that mark. It was the signature of short arcing, the beginning of insulation fatigue. He traced it with his thumb and felt the raised metal edges, brittle as bone. The reading on his meter confirmed it. Resistance higher than regulation. He logged the number in his mind, not on paper. His superior, Haupttechniker Müller, passed behind him, cigarette already half lit. "It's fine," he said without stopping. "The insulation's old. They'll be long gone before it matters." He tapped ash into the snow and kept walking. Otto nodded, but his eyes lingered on the plate. "They'll be long gone before it matters." The phrase settled like dust in his head, heavy and dismissive. By 7 a.m., the yard began to stir into rhythm. Shunting engines clanged. Chains rattled. The hiss of coupling valves bled through the fog. Otto stood near the relay housing, clipboard pressed against his chest. The reading still troubled him. The gauge needle wavered faintly even when idle. Current leaking where none should flow. He adjusted the probe once, then again. The hum returned each time, faint but certain. Somewhere beneath the metal casing, a wire was bleeding charge. He turned toward the supervisor's shack, hesitated, then stopped. A report meant delay. Delay meant inquiry. And inquiry meant suspicion. The last man who halted a departure over unverified anomalies had been reassigned to frontline depot duty, an unspoken punishment for hesitation. The system ran on speed, not doubt. Otto looked back at the relay and saw only movement. Men lifting crates, chains slapping against iron, steam thickening over the rails. He closed the housing and sealed the latch. When the line inspector approached, cigarette in mouth, Otto heard the faint snap again, the sound of a current jumping. The inspector struck a match, the flame reflecting off the casing's surface. For a brief second, light met metal, and Otto saw the wire pulse, a single spark hidden behind glass. The inspector didn't notice. He inhaled deeply, the ember flaring against the dull copper hue of the connector plate. The engine driver blew the whistle once. Pressure rose in the lines, steam roared, and the convoy jolted forward by inches. Otto stepped back from the platform. He felt the vibration in his boots, in the soles, in the ribs. Every bolt and bracket hummed under tension. The rhythm felt wrong, too sharp, too alive. He imagined the entire system breathing, mechanical lungs expanding, each relay a valve, each coupling a heartbeat. The sound of it filled the fog, the world's largest machine inhaling before the exhale. He couldn't name what disturbed him, not the spark, not the sound, not the phrase his superior had left behind. Just the feeling that something inside the system had begun to turn against itself. The convoy rolled away, swallowed by mist, rails shining wet in the early light. Otto watched until the last car vanished, then turned back toward the silent junction. The scorch mark was still there, a reminder, a warning. Sometimes the system speaks quietly before it breaks. The question is whether anyone is still listening. Would you have ignored the hum? By evening, the fog had thickened again, rolling low across the freight yard until lanterns glowed like submerged stars. Steam from the idle engines drifted through it, pale ribbons twisting in the dark. Otto Creamer stood alone at the signal junction, gloves damp, schematic unfolded on his clipboard. The paper had softened from the moisture, the ink bleeding at the edges. He read the orders once more. Confirm circuit integrity. Sign off departure log. No delays. The handwriting was precise, deliberate, detached. The tone of command distilled to ink. The field phone at the control shed crackled alive. Inspection report. Line B. The voice on the other end belonged to the regional inspector, clipped and cold. It carried that bureaucratic chill Otto had learned to dread. The sound of men who measured safety in signatures, not in sparks. He gave his acknowledgement, his words short, his tone even. Final confirmation pending. There was silence, then a pause long enough to make its meaning clear. Pending is not acceptable, Engineer Kremer. Confirm and clear. That train leaves at 20 hour. He placed the receiver back on its hook. Around him, the yard's machinery murmured like a hive. Valves ticking, chains swaying, the faint metallic rhythm of readiness. Otto crouched near the relay box again. The scorch mark he'd seen at dawn had deepened. The metal around it was hot. He pressed a finger close, felt the radiating warmth through the glove. The circuit was drawing more current than the readings showed. The schematic before him mapped the connection like a confession. The grounding path was flawed. Feeding charge through a bypass meant only for test loads. If it failed, the fuse cars would ignite in sequence. a linear burn through steel, powder, and men. He checked the gauge again. The needle trembled just under tolerance. On paper, it was fine. In reality, it was lying. He could see it in the flicker of the indicator bulb, hear it in the faint hum that never steadied. To alter the grounding path, he would need to reroute through an auxiliary line, grounding it to the brake housing instead of the primary bus. It was possible. It was also forbidden. The manual on his bench stated clearly, no unsanctioned modifications to armed circuits. But manuals never stood in the cold fog. Manuals never heard electricity breathe beneath crates of high explosives. Otto thought of the men who would ride that train through the night. Signalmen, guards, engine crew. He could already picture their faces under the amber light, unaware that the system trusted paperwork more than human sense. He remembered his father's workshop in Stuttgart, the old man testing live circuits with bare hands, touching the line just long enough to feel it hum. Control, he used to mutter, means knowing when to let go. Otto exhaled once, long and controlled. The fog condensed on his eyelashes. He turned the relay housing open and loosened the locking screw. The hum grew louder, a tone buried in the metal, like a cord held too long. He removed the grounding strap, rerouted the wire, tightened it again. The spark jumped once, bright and brief, then silence. The meter's needle dropped back to zero, steady and still. He stood up slowly. Somewhere beyond the fog, the station bell marked 8:01 p.m. The yard came alive in response, engines chuffing, brakes releasing, the long mechanical breath of departure. Otto closed the housing, wiped the moisture from his hands, and stepped back into the mist. By the time the train began to move, the system had already accepted his choice as part of its design. The log would show operational. The inspector would sign. The convoy would roll east through the night, never knowing a single relay had been altered by instinct, not order. Sometimes procedure keeps the machine running. Other times, it's the man who breaks it that saves it. The night had grown colder. Frost gathered along the rails again, clinging to couplings, crawling over the steel plates that formed the freight yard's spine. When Otto Creamer stood before the open relay box for the last time, the air was still except for the faint rhythm of steam from the idle locomotives. Their breath rose in slow intervals, vanishing into the fog like the exhalation of buried engines. He worked without sound, every motion deliberate, every decision stripped of ceremony. He unfolded his pocket blade and scraped the insulation from a narrow section of wire, thin enough to reroute, small enough that no inspector would ever notice. The copper gleamed under his lantern, a quiet pulse of red and gold. He adjusted the path through a shorter ground loop, bypassing the fault he had traced all day. A forbidden correction, the kind that existed nowhere in manuals, but everywhere in memory. The kind old mechanics called survival. The current steadied almost immediately. The meter's needle stopped twitching, settling into stillness. On paper, the reading was safer than before, exactly within regulation. But Otto knew what the instruments couldn't feel. The circuit was balanced on its edge. One vibration too strong, one surge too sudden, and the current would reverse back through the fuse bank. A perfect reading built on fragile truth. He stayed crouched for a long moment, watching the faint blue corona shimmer between terminals. It was almost silent now, a hum reduced to the faintest breath. Beyond the fog, the main engine released a low hiss, pressure rising through the valves, signaling readiness. Time had run out. At 03:10 a.m., the yardmaster gave the final order. Chains unlatched, couplings locked, and 30 freight cars shuddered into motion. Steel ground against frost as the train began to crawl forward. Otto stepped back, wiping his palms against his coat. The mist folded around him, swallowing his shape until he looked part of the yard itself. Motionless, undefined. He felt no triumph, no dread, only the quiet relief of completion. The first locomotive groaned past him, black iron marked by heat and oil. Sparks flared briefly under its wheels. The smell of steam and carbon filled the air, carried by the wind across the freight lot. Otto glanced toward the signal tower. The light flicked from amber to green with mechanical indifference. The convoy would reach the front in 30 hours, barring delays. His name would not appear anywhere in its records. The train gained speed, its rhythm growing steadier, the sound flattening into the distance. The red taillight pulsed through the fog until it dimmed to a faint ember. Then it was gone. Otto stood where it had vanished, boots pressed into the frost-darkened earth. He heard the last vibration fade through the rails, a deep, residual hum that lingered longer than the sound itself. He turned back toward the workbench. Only his tools remained: pliers, a coil of solder, a strip of wire curled neatly near the edge, its shape bent into a question mark by accident or design. He set the pocket blade beside it, wiped his gloves clean, and closed the ledger without writing a single word. The fog thickened again. The yard returned to its static rhythm, dripping valves, ticking metal, distant engines breathing in sleep. For a moment, it was as though nothing had been touched, nothing altered. Yet somewhere deep in the circuitry, a new current moved. Quiet, efficient, unrecorded. The system would continue as it always had. Orders intact, schedules met. Only one man would know that perfection was now held together by a single human instinct. Sometimes, survival depends on a rule quietly broken. Section 7. Payoff elsewhere. The distant thunder 4 hours later, at a switching junction near Fulda, the fog had thinned to a low, drifting haze. The rails ran cold and clean under the faint light of distant yard lamps. The ammunition train from Kassel slowed for a signal change, its steel wheels ringing in slow rhythm against the frost. The crew stepped out briefly, breath rising in white clouds, their words lost in the hiss of pressure valves. Nothing appeared wrong. The circuits glowed stable, the gauges obedient. Somewhere inside the convoy, charge slept within copper and powder, silent, waiting. Then it came, a single sound. Small, no louder than a fuse box snapping shut. A faint crack swallowed by the air. One witness, a signal operator half a kilometer away, later said he thought it was a coupling strike. Another described it as static, the kind that crawled over telegraph lines before a storm. Then came the second sound, sharper, fuller, followed by a bloom of orange that rose against the night like an inverted sunrise. The air folded, then tore. Freight cars erupted in sequence, not from impact, but from design. The same mechanical precision that once defined their loading now dictating their destruction. Each detonation triggered the next, rolling through the length of the train like a chain of dominoes made of fire. The sound carried across fields, through sleeping villages. Roof tiles rattled, windows cracked, cows startled in barns. For miles around Fulda, people woke thinking thunder had come early, echoing from the east. The radio network flared alive for 30 seconds. Calls overlapped. Fire brigades, yard masters, military signalmen. Then static consumed everything. The final transmission from Fulda contained only 3 words before cutting to silence. Freight train, ignition complete. The line went dead. Back in Kassel, dawn had not yet broken. Otto Kremer was at the relay house, recalibrating a field unit left from the night's inspection. His hands moved steadily, tracing connections, tightening screws. The air smelled of warm dust and ozone. Behind him, the field phone clicked once, then crackled. A voice, subdued and faint through static, said only, "Ammunition train, gone." The rest dissolved into noise. Otto didn't move. He set his tool down beside the coil, eyes fixed on the meter needle. It held steady, unwavering, as if nothing outside existed. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't need to. The balance had shifted somewhere far beyond him, a correction he had already felt coming. The system had consumed its own fault. He exhaled once, slowly. The sound blended with the hum of the live circuit beside him. The relay clicked, steady and indifferent. Around him, the machinery continued its rhythm, unchanged, unfeeling. Another train was already being prepared in the yard. The timetable would adjust. The ledger would note a loss, then resume. By mid-morning, smoke from Fulda was visible only as a gray smudge on the horizon. Reports would frame it as electrical failure. No mention of inspection, no mention of deviation. The records would show the system intact, the cause undetermined. Replacement orders were issued before noon. The network absorbed the impact, closing around the absence like metal cooling after heat. In the silence that followed, Otto wound the spare wire from his bench into a tight coil and placed it in his pocket. The day continued as scheduled. Men shouted, valves hissed, locomotives awoke. The world returned to its pattern. Somewhere, a stopwatch that had once measured current now lay buried under wreckage. Its ticking ended at the moment of detonation. Systems endure. Men vanish into them. Would you have touched the wire, knowing the thunder it carried? Days later, gray uniforms filled a cold conference room in Kassel. The air smelled of ink, tobacco, and damp wool. Outside, sleet tapped against the window panes, soft and irregular, as though trying to match the rhythm of the ticking clock on the wall. The board convened without emotion. 3 officers, 2 engineers, 1 clerk taking notes in careful columns. Their task was to assign reason, not meaning. They began with facts: time of departure, tonnage of load, route to Fulda. The explosion reports were read aloud with mechanical cadence. Temperature, wind, rail condition, ignition sequence. The terms sabotage, infiltration, faulty wiring passed across the table like standard tools of diagnosis. Each explanation was weighed, dissected, and then quietly filed away. None contained what they were searching for, a human variable that could be erased without disrupting the system. When Otto Creamer was summoned, the officers spoke to him through the filter of bureaucracy. The first question concerned protocol, the second compliance. Were readings within tolerance? One asked. Otto nodded. Yes. His tone remained level, his posture still. Another officer leaned forward, voice colder. Did you make adjustments? Otto answered as if reciting a test report. All circuits matched specification at dispatch. Nothing more. They studied him for signs of guilt, hesitation, tremor, shift in breath. There were none. To them, his calm resembled ignorance or perhaps obedience. They recorded it as no anomaly detected. The hearing lasted less than an hour. A formal statement followed, stamped with red ink. No external sabotage. Probable materials fault. In truth, Otto understood exactly what had happened. The system had corrected itself in the only way it knew, through destruction. His alteration, intended as protection, had become the trigger. Yet to confess would achieve nothing. The system did not recognize conscience as input. It recycled blame like any other resource, redistributing it until no one part bore the full load. Machines failed cleanly, men did not. He was reassigned 2 weeks later to a munitions plant outside Hanover. No commendation, no punishment, just a transfer order folded into his ration booklet. His new post involved voltage testing on delay fuses. Monotonous, silent work. Each relay click sounded identical, each current reading perfectly stable. But beneath the hum, something lingered. Memory. At night, when the plant's engines wound down, he could still hear the freight yard. The hiss of fog against steel, the crack of live current finding ground, the slow groan of a train pulling free from ice. Every click of a relay reminded him of that night in Kassel, how a single adjustment had erased an entire timetable. Somewhere, schedules had been rewritten, losses reaccounted, production recalibrated. The system had absorbed the absence and continued forward without pause. He kept his tools clean, his logbooks precise. But he no longer trusted silence. Machines, he realized, obeyed physical laws more moral than men. They did only what they were built to do. They carried no deceit, no pretense, no politics. When they failed, they announced it honestly, with sparks, smoke, or silence. Men, however, failed in secret and called it duty. By spring, Otto's name disappeared from the investigation files. The board's conclusion was archived under transport irregularity. The system closed the case exactly as it opened it, efficiently, without trace. In a war built on precision, even error became part of the design. Would you have told them the truth, knowing they would only correct the record, not the system? After the war, no one remembered Otto Kremer. His name dissolved into paperwork, pages lost between inventories and requisition forms. The freight yard at Kassel was dismantled by new hands, its rails lifted and melted for reconstruction. Grass grew between the foundations, moss overtook the drainage ditches, and the air that once carried the hiss of boilers now settled into stillness. The system moved on, rebuilt under different banners, driven by the same belief in precision. Only fragments of Otto's work survived. Initials scrawled beside resistance readings, signatures on test forms, small confirmations that the current once passed through his hands. The world he had served became an archive. The trains, the circuits, the ledgers, all inherited by a piece built on the same mechanical faith. That order was safety. That accuracy was virtue. Yet buried beneath that logic, the faint trace of Otto's defiance remained. A quiet anomaly, a single human decision folded into the machinery's perfection. The record would call it maintenance. History would call it nothing. But within the logic of his act, there lingered an equation that no system could correct. Precision as rebellion. Fault as justice. By the 1950s, the old yard was replaced by a power turbine factory. Workers arrived each morning to the same rhythm. Whistles, sirens, and the dull metallic heartbeat of progress. They never knew that the concrete beneath their feet had once been scorched by the explosion of a train, nor that a man had stood here once, adjusting a single wire. The foundations carried no plaque, no warning, only the hum of new engines rising from the ruins of the old. In industrial philosophy, failure is a statistic, measured, categorized, resolved. But human failure resists classification. Otto Kremer's act was neither sabotage nor loyalty. It was a form of control, a gesture made within silence. He understood what the system never could, that perfection hides decay, that the purest current can burn without warning. To break the rule was not defiance but understanding. In an empire of procedures, that was the most forbidden knowledge of all. Elsewhere, nations recorded victories in tonnage, distance, and production rate. But the real victories of war were quieter, found in the moments when men like Otto chose to alter one connection, disrupt one perfect line, and remind the machine that its rhythm depended on human hands. The factories that followed would repeat his discipline but forget his doubt. They would prize precision, never realizing that its greatest strength had once been used to undo itself. Decades later, when the factory finally closed, the archives listed no entry for the man who rewired a fuse in 1944. His initials on a resistance log were misread as a drafting mark. His workbench was scrapped with the rest of the yard's equipment. The only thing that endured was the principle his silence had embodied. That control is not obedience, but judgment. That systems endure not because men follow them, but because someone, somewhere, knows when not to. In the calculus of war, some victories are written in reports. Others vanish in smoke, erased by their own necessity. Otto Kremer's story belongs to the latter, a moment where a machine corrected itself by human instinct, not command. The result was destruction, The legacy was balance. Some say precision saves lives. Others know it sometimes demands a fault. Would you have trusted the fuse or your instinct?